there neighbors, Kevin here with eTrailer, and today we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Hellwig rear anti-sway bar here on our 2015 Chevy Silverado 1500. If you own a Silverado and you're looking for better handling out of it and you're not wanting to be shifting around in your seat as you start to make a turn, then adding an anti-sway bar could be the right fit for you. Now, an anti-sway bar isn't a magic fix for all of those issues. There are some other components that are going to play into this, and that is going to be your suspension with your vehicle, and that's typically going to be your leaf springs, your shocks, and then also maybe your jounce bumper. So if some of those components are starting to wear, that could be really playing into why you start to lean too much and start having that swaying feeling as you're going down the road. Now, the vehicle is typically going to have a front anti-sway bar, but a rear one is typically not included unless you have some kind of upgraded package. So this is always, or most typically, going to be an additional component that we're adding on. So after having this myself for a little bit, I can tell you it does make quite a difference. Just getting out there, you feel like you are nice and flat, and it doesn't feel like you're really shifting as much as you start to make turns. So this can be a giant help if you have offset loads, or maybe you tow a trailer and you want to make sure that you're getting there nice and safely. So why don't we go and pull into the shop, we can get under the truck and we can take a better look at our anti-sway bar. So taking a closer look at our sway bar here, this is going to be a 1 1/8 inch in diameter. Now, the thicker the sway bar that you have on here, the better it's going to perform, because this is essentially a spring that's going to be sitting between the two frame rails, and as you start to shift the weight between those two frame rails when you're maybe making a turn, or you've got heavy load more facing one side of the vehicle versus the other, it's going to want to try and pull that, and this is that spring that's helping pull it right back, because this wants to retain its original shape. So anytime you start putting pressure on one of the end links here, it's wanting to pull itself right back and keep you nice and straight. So our sway bar itself is made of a 4140 chromoly steel, which is a low alloy steel. So that way it doesn't have a lot of other metals mixed in with it, and that is giving it its stiffness. So this is made specifically for hardness here, and that is what we need, because this is a high fatigue situation when it comes to an anti-sway bar. So having that better steel is going to give you a much better performance. Another thing with that is we have a nice textured finish, so you're going to have a really nice looking anti-sway bar. You're not going to have that gross gloss black coating on there that eventually just starts to corrode and look kind of ugly under your vehicle. And then also, when it comes to the actual stiffness of our bar, we can adjust it because we have 3 separate holes right here where our end link can tie into. Now, the outermost hole is going to be the softest version of this, and as we start going into those 2 other holes, that's where it's going to start getting stiffer and stiffer. So the best course of action is to always start out on that outer hole. Make sure that you actually like how that ride quality feels before you end up swapping over to any of the others. Really, that's just going to be down to personal preference and essentially what you're planning on hauling in your vehicle. As you're adding more weight, you might need a little bit more stiffness just to kind of help offset that additional weight that might be throwing your suspension side to side. So there are other options out there. There are some thicker ones. Roadmaster has a 1 1/2 inch that would be a bit bigger than our sway bar that we have from Hellwig here, but the caveat is this is a completely bolt-on installation. There's no drilling required. Whereas the Roadmaster kit is going to require you to drill into the frame rail so that you can mount up the end link brackets. So that install becomes a whole lot more difficult, and there's much more time spent on it versus just throwing on this easy to use Hellwig sway bar. So aside from just the differences between the different brands and the thickness of the actual bar itself, there is also another kit as well, depending on if you have a lift kit or not. So if it's from 4 inches to 6 inches of lift, then we still have you covered with Hellwig. But now that we've kind of gone over a little bit more of the details on our anti-sway bar here, why don't we talk about the install itself. So with this one being a bolt-on, no drilling install, it's pretty easy to do. The only issue I really had was the instructions aren't super clear, kind of wishy-washy on some certain parts, so it does give you a little bit of gray area where you gotta kind of figure things out yourself. But that could just be because there are slight variances between vehicles, and if they sit there and they say, hey, all these specific things, then it's going to make it to where someone with a different trim package or someone where the lines are ran slightly different might run into some issues and not understand how to do it. So At this point, this is where, you know, we typically want to look and see if anyone else has any kind of info and if there's videos available, just like what we're doing right now. So if that is you, you're the one that's going to be doing this at home, then stick around, and in just a bit I will walk you through the install process. But if you're feeling like you don't really want to do this yourself, you just don't have the time, and maybe you got a big trip coming up and want to make sure that you have the best ride quality on the way down to that trip, then please feel free to use our dealer locator, and you can enter in your zip code to find a shop near you and get it professionally installed. So to start off our install, if you are going to be using a lift to get a little bit more room under here to work, you want to make sure that you are lifting by the suspension. We want to have our normal ride height while we're setting this up to make sure that we have our end links at the correct height. So as you can see, I'm lifted up by my wheels right now. I've already got my spare tire out of the way. You're definitely going to want to do that because we are going to be mounting up to this cross member here. So we're going to need the room to work and get everything in place. And that spare tire is really just going to eat into all of the space that we need right now. So get that out of the way, and then we're going to come back to our hardware here. We've got our sway bar, and it's going to sit just like this, where it's kind of angling down as it gets to our differential. You're going to see this hump where it comes out away from the differential, so make sure that you have this oriented correctly. And we're going to put on our D-shaped spacers here, our bushings, and we're going to be using a little bit of our lube. So I'm going to spray some of this in here. Now you won't want to use all of it just because we are going to lubricate our bushings later on for our end links, which are these guys right here. But they do luckily give you 2 packs of it. So I'm going to get this in, kind of mixed around. And the whole point of this is as your suspension compresses and decompresses, that bar is going to be slightly moving back and forth, and that's going to help prevent it from squeaking. So once we get that on, we can then pop on our bushing. And I'm going to do the same thing over on the other side. Make sure you have a shop towel or a napkin or something with you. You can wipe off real quick. This stuff kind of does get everywhere. Next, we're going to be relocating our parking brake line here because we're going to have some U-bolts that are going to clamp onto our axle. And there's going to be this little bracket that we're just going to pop right on here just to kind of give us a little bit more clearance there. And we're going to have a 5/16 bolt and nylock nut that we're going to be adding on. Now you have that factory bolt right here, and on the inside is a weld nut. We are going to remove this, push this up onto our bracket, and then reuse that factory bolt and nut. And then the new one is going to be what holds on our line here. So to take that off, you're going to need a 1/2-inch wrench, and then when we're putting on that new one, we're going to need that 1/2-inch wrench along with, wrench and socket is what I meant to say. But for just this part, we don't need a wrench. Grab our bracket. We'll just put that back on. That straight and a little crooked here. And now, nut and bolt. I'm going to see if I can do the bolt head on this side, but I don't know if that's going to be the case. And our bracket's a little weird. So there's a little lip on this bracket. It's not going to line up because of that lip, so I'm going to have to do this on the inside and hold it. So in this situation now, I got less space. I'm going to have to do the bolt from the inside out. There we go. Put our nut on. Oh. A little bit of a juggling act here to get all these to sit just right. I might switch over to my other ratchet. Make this a little bit easier for us. go. Now we're going to take our U-bolts. These are the 1/2-inch ones. You got some smaller ones, but those are going to be for later on. These are going to slide right onto our axle. You're going to see right in between the rear differential and the bracket we just installed. If you come over on the driver's side, it's the same deal. We want that kind of inside. It's going to be away from your shocks. And then from there, we are going to have these brackets. These are going to butt up to our axle, just like so, once we get that on the U-bolt. And then those D-shaped brackets that are going to match up with the bushings that we have on our sway bar are going to butt right up onto that. We'll have a flat washer and then a nut to stick on there and tighten down, and that's going to hold this up. But at this point, you got a lot of different components that you're trying to kind of hold all at once while you also try to put that hardware on. So this is a point where you're going to want to grab a second set of hands, maybe even a third set of hands, so you can have someone hold it, get all of the components sandwiched together, and then put on your washer and nut. So I'm going to grab my friend Jesse, and then we'll be able to get this in place. All right, you're going to want to hold on to the D-shaped bracket. It will fall right off those bushings. So I'm going to try and line it all up all at once here. May have to kind of work back and forth with your extra set of hands to get everything lined up properly. Then we'll put on our flat washer, our nut. Once you get a couple threads on, that should help hold it up a bit so you can get the rest of the hardware in place. Of course, all kind of wants to spin on you. There we go. Just going to get this till the bolt is at the bottom of the nut here. So we did have this plastic bracket that just kind of hose clamps essentially to our axle, and that was holding the brake line here. Now kind of thrown off our orientation with our sway bar. It kind of needs to be exactly where that bracket was. So I've taken that off. We've got some good space, probably about 1/4 inch between our hard line and our U-bolt here, so I'm not too worried about that, and it's honestly supported pretty well here because we also have that bracket right here holding it a couple inches away. So I may potentially reinstall this just a little bit further over. We'll see kind of how that fits once we have our sway bar actually in place to make sure that there's nothing else that it's going to interfere with. Next, we're going to be lubricating the bushings and the sleeves for our eyelets on our end links. So these bigger ones are going to pop right into the hole here, and then the sleeve is going to go inside that. So we need to make sure that we have it lubricated so it's going to be able to actually slide in on both the sleeve and for our bushing into there. The big thing here is also, this is going to help prevent squeaking and also just make it able to move as your suspension compresses. Let's do a little bit more than that on here. So now we're going to press our bushings and then our sleeves in as well into our end links here. You could honestly do it by hand. I did it on the first one by hand, but it was just annoying because it keeps wanting to slide around just because of the lubricant we put on there and because of the shape of it. So I'm going to just switch over to our vise, make this a little bit easier. So that'll just push it right on in. And once you have that in, we can now slide in our sleeve. And we'll just repeat that process with the other end links. Now we're going to be grabbing our smaller U-bolts, and we're going to be going on the cross member right where our spare tire sits. So we're going to throw this in right close to the frame rail side here. On the driver's side, it's a little bit more difficult. There is a mount right in the way. Also, the wiring harness right here, there's a zip tie, which they ran through the tube somehow, and then zip tied another zip tie to that one, and then that was holding the wiring on. It wasn't able to get totally out, but it's enough out of the way for me that I can actually get this in. So we'll have our U-bolt, and it's going to be basically right up against that mount. So just like our axle brackets, we're going to have another set of brackets that are going to mount up against that tube, and these are going to be what our end links mount to. Now on the passenger side, it's going to be this smaller one, and that'll butt right up to it. On the driver's side, it's going to be this larger one that's got more of an offset to it. So that is going to push up just like so, and then our end links will be able to mount to it. So in our kit, we're going to have that flat washer, and we have mechanical lock nuts. These are going to be different from the rest of the bolt nuts in there. And once you get this past a certain point, it's going to need a wrench because this is cutting into the thread, so that way it can't be taken back off. That way you don't have to worry about it loosening up later on. And sometimes getting it started can be a little bit of a fight here. Now I'm going to be leaving this pretty loose just because this is probably going to need to angle back just a bit to match up with our end link, but we won't know that exactly until we have everything kind of in place. So all of the hardware we're putting on right now is pretty much just going to be loose until the very end when we can tighten it all down once we have everything kind of set perfectly. So in the kit there's going to be 2 jam nuts that we're going to be putting on our end links. We're going to run this down pretty far just to give us some room to work with while we figure out what the length actually needs to be. You'll also want to pick up some black spray paint and clear, because once we get this set, we're going to also spray paint all of these threads. They don't add any spray paint at the factory just so that it's not stopping you when you're trying to work with the jam nut and thread it into the other half of the end link. So this is something you will want to do yourself just to prevent corrosion. And I'm going to just give this a couple of spins here, and we'll do the same with our other end link. Now we're going to be taking our 2 1/4 inch bolts. If you measure, don't include the head in that measurement, and that'll tell you exactly which one you're looking for. And on our end links, the threaded portion is going to be our upper link. So we're going to get that situated up here. We'll place one of our bolts through, and then we're going to thread on one of the lock nuts. And like I said, we'll just leave all that kind of loose for right now until we have all of our adjustments done. And then same thing over on our driver's side. Bushing's kind of fighting me here, but Alright, so at this point now we need to figure out what our height needs to be with our end links. The goal here is to get the bar as level as possible. We want this nice and parallel with our frame rail, but we also want our end link to be vertical. We want that as straight as possible. I can't really adjust this up anymore, so I've kind of moved it up a little bit more with our U-bolts on our axle here, but I'm at a point where I can't go anymore because my brake line's in the way. So this is about as level as we are going to get here. Now you can undo the threads on here to kind of change that length, or go back up if you need to raise it up a little bit more. I think with us though, I want to make sure I have enough threads in there. I don't want to take it out too far. And the center hole has us pretty level. At least that's keeping us straight up and down. I think I might drop it just a bit because they do technically want you to go with the rearmost hole on this. Now another thing that you might run into is, hey, there's still a gap between the end link and the sway bar itself, and probably it's going to be on your driver's side just because there's a lot of extra stuff here. The bracket and that shock mount could potentially have you just sit a little bit further out, and if that's the case for you, there is a 1/2 inch bushing or spacer and then longer bolts that are going to go through it. So if that ends up being the case for you, you can grab the longer bolt, pop that in your spacer, and then have your sway bar come up and sit with that. But I don't think I really need it on mine. We'll just have to tighten that down a bit more, but it is sitting pretty close to the sway bar, so I'm not super worried about it. As far as setting this up though, this is something, like I said, you're just gonna have to sit there and play with it back and forth to get it exactly how you want it. I feel if we go with the rearmost hole, we're now not getting our end link as straight as we would potentially want, but that is getting our bar a lot more straight than it is with the center hole, because the center hole we have to lift up just a bit more. So, what do you think, Tom?
I like the middle.
You like the middle?
Yep.
All right. Let's see. One, two, three. All right, so it took a little bit of playing around. I did tilt this a little bit, which they even talk about a bunch of times in the instructions is, hey, you are gonna have this at a slight angle. And then same thing with the U-bolt up top. I kind of had to play with it back and forth. That way I could try to get my end link as straight as possible. So now I'm gonna be throwing on one of the bolts. I'm not using the longer one since we don't need that 1/2-inch spacer. And I'm gonna put a washer on the end of that. We'll slot that through, and I'm going with the rearmost hole. Another flat washer, and then our lock nut. And I'm just gonna repeat this over on the other side as well. And at this point, now we can start tightening some things down. And once we get it all tight, I'm also going to spray paint the threads on here. So they say in the instructions that they don't put the paint on there, so that way you can actually get your nuts tightened down on it and not have to fight through all that. But once you are done, you will want to spray paint it, and I'm going to also hit it with some clear coat after the black paint dries, just to kind of keep any corrosion from happening here. But we'll get this jam nut down, both. So now that I'm happy with my alignment here, I'm gonna just snug each nut down before I torque them. If you look at your instructions, I think it's the very first page, at the very bottom they have the torque ratings listed for you depending on the bolt size. When you're tightening down your U-bolts, make sure that you are giving this even pressure to both sides. You don't want to go too much on one side and have this kind of have way too much tension on one side and then be kind of loose on the other. And we're going to also torque these down. Once these are torqued down, the last 4 nuts that are in your kit are going to go right on these as well. And these are going to act as somewhat of a jam nut. All right, with those both torqued, now I'll get on those nuts I was just talking about. So those will just thread right on. And I will torque that as well. So when we're tightening down on our bushings here, we just want to go till it starts to kind of bulge on that bushing. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you start to kind of clamp down on it. It'll start to kind of squeeze in, and it'll get a little bit fatter out here because we're now trying to compress that down. So you just want to go till it's just starting to bulge like that, and then you can stop. With these being mechanical lock nuts, it's not going to back off again, because if it does, it'll start to cross thread, and then that should prevent it from being able to back off. But like with any other component on our vehicle, routine maintenance is going to be just double checking that each one of our bolts and nuts are all nice and tight and we're all still torqued down. As you start to take this out and test drive it, and then your trips later on, as time goes on, all the vibration and road shock that you get can eventually wiggle some of the hardware loose. So it's super important that maybe once in a while, if you're a heavy hauler, maybe once a month you're checking this. If it's an occasional tower, maybe you're checking it every 3 months. So for these jam nuts, I used a 7/8 wrench, and I've tightened that down. And now to spray paint our threads, I just cut a section of our box off and jammed it up in there, so I'm not overspraying onto other components here. All right, I'm hitting this with some clear coat now. While I was waiting for the black paint to dry, I also messed around with my brake line here. So this is a good time to kind of just double check, make sure none of your lines are gonna rub against anything. So this hard line here, I did kind of just push a little bit. I bent it up a little bit more because it was really close to that U-bolt bracket. I also threw back on that plastic bracket that kind of clamps onto the axle tube and helps hold that up. So other than that, that's really the only spot where we have any kind of issue. Over here, we've got probably a 1/2 inch gap, so don't need to worry about that. But like I said, just double check your stuff, make sure you're not gonna have an issue. Once we get past this point, now we're gonna be dropping this back down, test driving it, and then just double checking all of our tightness, and then also making sure that nothing kind of shifted or anything like that, and then we are running into an issue where something might be rubbing. Well, that's going to do it for our look at and installation of the Hellwig rear anti-sway bar here on our 2015 Chevy Silverado 1500. My name's Kevin. If you still have some questions about what's going to be the right rear anti-sway bar for your Silverado, please feel free to reach out to us via our Ask the Experts link, a comment on this video, or a phone call to a customer service department, and we'd be happy to help you out on your journey.